Good evening, and welcome to this special event to celebrate International Women's Day. I'm Monica Shaneko, and I'm the Director of Collections here at State Library Victoria. On behalf of State Library Victoria, I acknowledge the traditional lands of all Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that our collections hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. I offer a very special welcome to Christine, President of Library Board Victoria, and other board members and Foundation Council members here tonight. And a very special welcome to Jane Hanson, who with her husband Paul Little enabled the development of the Conversation Quarter and Hanson Hall with their generous donation to the library's Vision 2020 development. Jane and Paul also endowed the South Rotunda Gallery, currently featuring the Baruch exhibition. Welcome, Jane, and thank you to you and Paul for your ongoing support of the library. It's my very great pleasure to be here today with our special guests, Maxine McKew AM, Krystyna Campbell-Pretty AM, and Dr Anna Welch, who will be talking about the women's suffrage movement and the related items that we've recently added to the Women's Writers' Fund. But before I begin, I'll note some local information for guests attending tonight. So this event will be filmed, so please switch your phones to silent. Bathrooms are located through the doors on that side there, and there are water stations throughout the rooms. A hearing loop is enabled and available if you need it, and please ask one of our staff for help. We look forward to hearing your questions for our panel at the end of the event. We'll also have a chance to view some of the suffragette-related items that you'll hear about today, as shown by our wonderful collection curators. These items were acquired as part of the Women's Writers' Fund, which was launched a few years ago with the very generous support of Krystyna Campbell-Pretty and Helen Sykes. Krystyna, of course, is one of our panellists here tonight, and Helen is here in the audience. A huge thank you to Krystyna and Helen for your passion and commitment to establishing the Women's Writers' Fund and for continuing to support it in a very hands-on way over the years. Krystyna and Helen established the fund to redress the historical gender bias in the state collection by acquiring works by 19th and 20th century women writers. And it's the first that specifically aims to correct a gender imbalance in an Australian public library collection. We aim to preserve and elevate women's voices through inclusion in the state collection so they can be accessed by generations to come. To date, the fund has acquired over 100 significant works by women writers, and that number continues to grow thanks to the support of our donors. Since co-founding the Women's Writers' Fund in 2021, Krystyna has been a constant supporter of this collecting initiative. I'm thrilled to announce her most recent donation to the collection, a 1668 first edition of the plays of Margaret Cavendish, and I have it on good authority that it arrived in the building this afternoon. Margaret Cavendish was a 17th century playwright, philosopher, poet, and scientist who published under her own name at a time when many women did not have that option. The volume of her plays acquired was printed in London by another fascinating woman, Anne Maxwell, who took over her husband's printing press after his death, and this was quite unusual at the time. Previously, the only work the library held by Margaret Cavendish was a first edition of the biography she wrote on her husband William, which is part of the John Emerson collection here at the library. We can now include this new significant women's own creative voice in the collection. Thank you, Krystyna, for donating this incredible work. Among our other recent acquisitions are texts and items relating to the Suffragette movement. You'll see books, jewellery, medals, and even a Suffragette card game. It's a fascinating collection documenting the history of women's suffrage, and I'm excited to have some of the highlights here to show you tonight. Our heartfelt thanks to everyone who has contributed to the Women's Writers' Fund over the years, especially found funders, Krystyna and Helen, who have been up at some very odd hours of the night, as I understand it, bidding at international auctions. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Maxine McKew. Maxine is in her 9th year as a board member here at the library and is also an Honorary Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Please join me in welcoming Maxine McKew.
Thank you, Monica, and good evening, everyone. Did you see, if you're up close, you could see Monica's green shoes. So I look out there and I know there's quite a lot of purple, white, green, the colours. Well done. To all of you, I know it's a few days after the event, but look, let me say, Happy International Women's Day. Hey! You are very welcome to this State Library event, which, as Monica has said, is showcasing some of our recent and most treasured acquisitions, documents and memorabilia that tell a more complete story of the long fight for women's suffrage and equality. As you'll see from the collections on display, the story is historic, it's literary, and it's textural. It is also lyrical, which is why we are going to start with a stirring song that has become an anthem of the women's movement.
Go marching, marching in the beauty of the day. A million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sound discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our life shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. As we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing, their ancient call for bread. Small art and love and beauty, their grudging spirits new. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we go marching, marching, we bring the braver days. The rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more the grudge and idler, and the toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glory, bread and roses, bread and roses, bread and roses.
Well, I thought you'd like that. Many of you will recognise that version by Judy Collins, that was recorded in 1976. But you know, that rallying cry, bread for all and roses too, was first articulated by the American activist Helen Todd, and it was associated with a very early strike by the Massachusetts textile workers in the early 1900s. And you know, I think it says much about the spirit of the movement, that women whose existence was often, as you could see in that film, was exceptionally marginal. They were also saying that the heart can starve as much as the body. Now, this is overwhelmingly an occasion for celebration. But, you know, when I hear that line in the song, unnumbered women dead, it's a dreadful reminder that for all of our progress, many women still fight every day for their safety. Depressingly, in Australia today, on average, 1 woman a week is murdered. We remember those women tonight, and perhaps 2 in particular here in Victoria. Samantha Murphy, who just a few weeks ago went out for a morning run and never came home. And Sweeta Madagani, found dead in a wheelie bin on the weekend. Sometimes there aren't any words, are there? But what we do know is that the story of women's right to be, our emergence as equal citizens and full participants, is still being challenged. So as I say, it's a complex, incomplete story. We're going to hear a lot tonight about activism, and that still matters. And the greater story matters. As we've heard, it's the enlightened efforts of our donors that's allowing libraries and institutions to tell a much bigger story about women. Our focus tonight is on that remarkable moment towards the end of the 19th century where women across many countries started to demand full voting rights. Now, you'll hear a lot about the English Pankhurst family tonight, but of course, Australian women, certainly non-Indigenous women, can claim to have got there first. Well, just after New Zealand, with the right to full suffrage arriving with Federation in 1901. And so to our discussion. Krystyna Campbell-Pretty is one of this city's most important philanthropists. She's a member of the board of the NGV and gives many important works to that institution. But along with her great visual sense, she is a lover of words, which is why in recent years she has worked with the library in acquiring many significant pieces. Tonight, Krystyna is going to talk about her research journey and how she came by some very particular pieces on display tonight. She's joined by Dr. Anna Welch, our Principal Collection Curator of Rare Books, and of course the Curator of the History of the Book, which happens to be one of my favourite exhibits here at the library. Anna's doctoral research was in aspects of medieval liturgy, but you know, I'm always astonished by Anna's range and expertise. In this building, we don't say ask a librarian, we say ask Anna. Now, I have one other thing I'm going to tease you with. We have, technology willing, a surprise guest joining us in a little while, so stay alert. Okay, Krystyna, I want to start the discussion with a very important item. One of your first acquisitions that got you interested in this whole area, and to quote Lady Bracknell, it was a handbag. Tell us about it.
Yes, in a fashion auction, of all things, vintage fashion auction in London, 2018. I was not there to see what I saw. There were many things I wanted to see. This surprised me, but the auctioneer said, "Have you seen the slave bag?" I said, "No." "What is it?" "Well, there it is." The slave bag is a work that was created by the Birmingham Women's Society around the mid-1820s as a work to fight against slavery, abolition. The Birmingham Female Society was a group of women opposed to slavery. They were abolitionists. And the men's societies would not let them join. So they set up their own. And within a few months, there were mushrooms of women's societies all through the country. They met regularly. They created works that could be sold or given away that were in effect propaganda, things to persuade people, to encourage people to oppose slavery, to vote against it in Parliament. And I think it was 7 years later, they succeeded. But I found this a very moving piece of work, and it set me thinking. I thought, what about suffragettes? I knew there was an enormous wealth of material. So while I was out there buying things for the NGV that related to abolition, I was also finding things related to suffrage. And there's quite a mine of these works out there. It's very rich in literary terms, in visual terms, anything from badges, medals, crockery, believe it or not, that was used in the WSPU tea rooms and also sold, a whole gamut of things. So I had a good couple of years collecting many of these things. Most have gone to the NGV, but more recently I've been focusing on collecting literary works, books, newspapers, and appropriate ephemera. So now the library collection has two of the principal medallions, if you want, or badges of honour, the Holloway brooch and the Hunger Strike medal. Yeah. So it all came from one thing.
Yeah.
Fashion.
And we're very grateful, Krystyna, you've moved up Swanston Street. Sort of very grateful.
Well, and importantly, I kept seeing wonderful literary things that really, they're not placed well at the NGV, whereas here they can join the research collection.
Have you all heard that? This is heresy. I'm just going to ask you to hold the wider suffragette story. We'll come back to it, because Anna, I want to bring you in at this point because there's an important addition we've got here that's a marker of, if you like, the modern women's movement, and it's Mary Wollstonecraft. So tell us that story.
That's right, and we're very fortunate. In fact, there's two works by Mary Wollstonecraft on the table this evening. Her Vindication of the Rights of Woman in a second edition published the same year as the first edition in 1792, and also her work on the revolution in France. And she was actually there during it, taking notes for this publication she eventually brought out in 1794. So I think, as you said, Wollstonecraft is a foundational figure in the British suffrage movement. She didn't come out of nowhere, of course. She comes from that intellectual world that we often refer to as the blue stockings, so called because they were groups of men and women who met in informal dress to talk about ideas, politics, art. And her, I guess, grounding in that movement was a part of how she came to her, at the time, radical ideas about the rights of women.
So what was both the English and the French reaction to the publication of Vindication?
That's a good question in terms of, I'm not sure what the French reaction was. I know that in Britain, she scandalised many people, not only for the content of the work, but because of her life, that she lived in a way, she was unmarried for a time, living with a man, and this scandalised her fellow activists. So even within the circles of people who were beginning to agitate for women's political rights, she was still pretty far out for them. But the arguments, of course, took root and have never gone away since. And I think it's an interesting comparison between Britain and France at that period, that in France during the Revolution, women were granted many civil rights, including being recognised as sort of adult people in the law for the first time, but they were not granted citizenship. They didn't get the equal political rights that came with those civil rights.
In fact, we should make the point, France did not grant women the vote until after World War II, the great revolutionary country that starts it all. Yeah.
Well, and women are left behind, and we can probably say something similar within the Australian context about the relationship between women's rights for settler women and Indigenous women. That
Indeed.
Changes don't come for everybody at the same time.
Indeed. Krystyna, to come back to you, so let's move on. We've got Mary Wollstonecraft at the end of the 18th century. So our focus now goes to England. You've mentioned the abolition movement, there's the Chartist movement, so there's a lot of ferment for social change. So take us through how we get to the argument and the groups that coalesce around women's suffrage.
Well, once men didn't get full suffrage until 1870. think 1871, but almost immediately the push became very active to get women the vote. There was a very strong reaction against that, of course. There was propaganda against women getting the vote from the 1880s onwards. So it wasn't quick, it wasn't fast, but by 1900, it was really developing a groundswell. So Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903 says it's all going too slow and decided to push ahead with a very strong movement that was very, very well organised, really along military lines, if you want to look at it that way. Excuse me. And the focus was on mobilising women, mobilising influential men, mobilising to push very, very hard for women to get the vote. So while it was bubbling along through the late 1800s, 1903 was really the birth of the suffragette movement, and that term was coined by the Daily Mail, meant to be a demeaning term, suffrage, but it was a suffragette. They meant it to push women down, but the suffragettes liked it. They adopted the name. So from 1903,
tell us about, sorry, no, I interrupted. I was just going to say, tell us about the Pankhurst family, because we've got Emmeline, the matriarch,
yes,
and 3 daughters. There's 2 sons, we don't hear much about them.
No,
tell us about the 3 daughters.
Well, the 3 daughters were all incredibly inspirational. Sylvia, who was an artist and was responsible for the whole look of the movement, the branding, the way the
We've
colours.
got a slide there, by the way.
Yes.
Sylvia on the far side.
Right.
Is that right? And Christabel in the middle?
Christabel, yes, who was equally strong, very active, incredibly active, was arrested a number of times. One point went to France to avoid being rearrested again. And Adela, who equally was very, very active. But Adela became quite sick with all of the stress and everything, and she ended up being sent to Australia to recover from her weak lungs or whatever it was, and she never returned. She married a trained unionist here and continued to live a very active life in terms of demonstrations, but on the other side of politics, if you like. She became much more right-wing. But it was Christabel and Sylvia who, together with Emmeline, were the front guard. There were many, many other women, but as a family, they were incredibly strong. And Mr. Pankhurst, the husband, the father, was also involved in the movement. It was really incredible to see a whole family dedicate itself in that way, totally self-sacrificial.
And Krystyna referred before the fact that it was set up like a militant organisation. Tell us about the activities as we're moving through the 1900s.
Well, there were many different branches, I suppose, of their activity, and I think that's what makes them such a fascinating example of a political movement, that on the one hand, they're very clever at the kind of gentle domestic propaganda of the card game and other crockery and other ways of sort of infiltrating into people's daily lives, but they certainly didn't shy away from well-organised militant protests that involved violence against...
They were terrorists.
That is certainly...
terrorists.
Yeah.
Was that term used at the time? Terrorist?
No,
No.
That's a modern term.
Yeah.
But when they were arrested, it was for criminal activities.
Yeah.
Arson was involved, smashing shop windows. They carried around little things, toffee hammers. Apparently you could smash a window very easily with one of these little hammers.
Yeah. And one should mention as well that
slashing pictures.
This is a pretty torrid time for the United Kingdom, because you've got the Irish Home Rule movement as well. Anarchists abroad in Europe, so...
And I think that, you know, the treatment of Prime Minister Asquith is one way in which we can see all of that coming together, in that he, I learned today, was known by his friends as Squiffy because he was fond of a drink, but that makes him sound like quite a benign character, but he certainly wasn't for the women's movement. He was opposed to women's suffrage despite coming from the Liberal Party, as indeed did Richard Pankhurst. So he was a contemporary of Emmeline, same age, but massively opposed to women having the vote because he saw it as not a human rights issue. I don't think that phrase existed for him. But he was attacked many times publicly by suffragettes wielding horsewhips and all kinds of things, so that there was a regular kind of lampooning of him, and you see some of cartoons on the screen of every time he went out, more or less, a group of suffragettes would physically attack him.
This just look at this one. This suggests his two-sided nature. So, Krystyna, did he give the suffragettes false hope at some point? Did he?
He kept sort of leading them along to make them think it was going to happen, but it never did. He just constantly let them down. I don't think he ever actually promised, but they interpreted wrongly his verbal cues, and he never did it. He never had any intention of doing it. And when that became apparent to them, they became extremely aggressive towards Asquith. They also did not like Winston Churchill for similar reasons.
And as
Were there any sympathisers in the Commons?
There were,
Yes.
and from within the Liberal Party. I think actually Asquith was an outlier in his own party, that most people saw the reason in what was being proposed, but he could not see it in those terms. He saw it as an unnecessary change to a political system that wasn't broken, so didn't need fixing.
There were significant numbers of mostly younger men, but men, very wealthy men, who were very much for the suffragette movement, and externally very clearly so. There were men's suffrage movements because they weren't allowed to join the WSPU, sorry. So they started their own, a little bit of the reverse.
So
psychology.
WSPU, we should just do it. Women's Suffrage
Social
is
Union.
it? Right. Okay. Right. WSPU. Okay. We're moving through the 1900s. We've got all this activity. Then we get to World War I, 1914, and this really splits the Pankhurst women, doesn't it?
Well, it did. I mean, there had already been a split in the suffragette movement in about 1909, I think, or 1907, because the women who didn't think they should be going for the extreme criminal activities split off and became just mostly compliant. Whereas the others continued their radical aggressive approach. But when war was declared, Emmeline said, no, we must stop all work, stop all protest, and we will just support the war effort in whatever way we can. Sylvia was absolutely aghast at that and completely opposed to it. She was very much a radical, a left-wing radical, in every possible way, and had great sympathies with the communist movement, both before and after the revolution in Russia. She married an Italian anarchist, I think, or no, she didn't marry. That was the whole point. She didn't marry an Italian anarchist, and she had a child, and her mother never spoke to her again. You know, so these were women, while they were out there in terms of their political views, their social views were still very, very conservative. So it's a shame because there was enormous rift in the family as a result. Christabel did continue to push during the war, but not to the point of having a break with her mother.
I wonder if either of you can comment on one theory I've read is that, I mean, Emmeline was not just pro-war. I mean, she was a full-on patriot, absolutely out there on the stump urging men to enlist and, you know, handing out the white feathers to those who did not enlist. Anna?
Yes, I mean, I think that's such an interesting tension point within the family, that you have Sylvia, who's a committed pacifist despite her militant activities for the suffrage cause, but a pacifist in terms of conflict of that scale. And you might almost see that as a generational shift perhaps in the family, that their mother was very much a woman of the 19th century, and certainly empire was at the heart of her sense of British identity, I think you could say. And for Sylvia, that was different. She was an internationalist. She was a socialist. She flirted pretty closely with communism and met with Lenin.
Not unusual for the time for activists.
No, absolutely. But they're two very different ends of a political spectrum.
Krystyna, this question of Emmeline, one reads that she actually did a deal with the government that she would be out there as a patriotic pro-war voice in exchange for those suffragettes who were still jailed being freed. Is that correct? What's your understanding?
I can't comment on that, actually.
Right.
I hadn't heard that one, but I wouldn't. That would be quite reasonable to expect. But regardless, all of the aggressive, if you want to call it violent activities, ended.
Ceases,
The force feeding ended. There was nothing anymore. Everything focused upon the war effort, which at that point was the majority of people. As the war went on, people became disengaged, but not to the extent of the whole population. There was always a strong movement amongst the intelligentsia that the war should never have happened. It was a colonial war, but that's a whole other issue. Yes, Emmeline was a good daughter of England.
Well, look, it's at this point there's someone who can actually flesh out this in a quite an intimate way. You're paying attention. I want to introduce at this point someone who, when she was growing up, heard these stories with her own family. We have been joined, technology willing, from London by the granddaughter of Sylvia Pankhurst, Dr Helen Pankhurst. Helen, I'm thrilled you can join us. You can't probably see us, but you're in one of our lovely spaces at the State Library Victoria. And we've been having a discussion about your extraordinary family. Now, as the granddaughter of Sylvia, what are the stories that you grew up with about these remarkable women? Because I've heard you say before, by the way, it tells you a lot that all four women are buried on different continents.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. It's morning, my side, rather early. There's so much to say. I did listen into that conversation just now, so I can maybe reflect on that as well. Where do we start? Maybe that link between the past and the present. You know, on so many of these issues, I expect that all of you are looking at the past with the lens of the current and seeing the resonances to what's going on today. I mean, including that mention of the ongoing inequalities around violence and also intersectional issues about who got the vote, you know, who was prioritized at any point, even within the category of women, which played out in Australia as well. But coming to my family in particular, what's, I think, really interesting is the fact that they came together on the cause and yet differed on so many other issues. And as you just said, the differences, I think, symbolically are reflected in the fact that you've got the four women buried in different continents. So Adela in Australia, the youngest, Sylvia, my grandmother in Ethiopia, Christabel in the States, and Emmeline in the UK. And they differed on issues of who to focus on. So class, Sylvia felt that those who needed the vote the most were the working class women, and it was important for their voices to be heard. Christabel and Emmeline became more and more conservative, and they felt the most strategic way of achieving change would be by focusing on those with power, potentially economic power, those who could open the door to others. Emmeline and Christabel thought that this was a military movement and you obey the leaders. You don't question, you do what's needed in a campaign. Sylvia thought that this was about democracy, in which case, clearly you listen to everybody and you make decisions collectively. Do you align to other issues or not? Do you just focus on women's rights, or do you look at the parallel between women's rights and other issues? What's the role of men in this? So played out within the family were schisms of the time about how best to do this, but they reflect, I think, much of the dilemmas about how to change things for women's lives today, and that link to the present.
Can you tell us a little? Sorry, I was just going to ask. Can you tell us a little bit about your grandmother? I gather she died just before you were born. I'm just wondering what stories you grew up hearing from your parents.
Well, because of the Ethiopia connection, she was, in a way, she moved on from one issue to another. She'd campaigned on the issues of the vote, of feminism, the UK. She moved to Ethiopia because of the invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini, and then Ethiopia became the key causes. So the family narratives was more about her role in Ethiopia rather than as a suffragette. But for me, it was that global feminism that comes through. So I grew up understanding issues of global inequalities as well as feminism, and in a way was able to put those two together. Likewise, for the fact that the cross-party nature of the family means that the campaigning for me is about understanding that role models of feminism can be in any space, including on the far left and the far right. And therefore, if you want to change politics in Parliament, for example, you need to have those linkages across party. Yeah. And I note again, the parallel between the past and the present. Women got the vote in Australia before they did in the UK. Currently, the Parliament in Australia is 37th in the world. You are 37th in the world in terms of the representation of women, and the UK is 48th in the world. So the better representation of women in Australia than there is in the UK. And I think that there's so much still to be done. And for me, that's part of that family heritage.
Indeed. Helen, I want to bring you to the collection, if I can, because we've got two issues, is it right, of Germinal, Sylvia's publication. Now, I'm sure as a scholar you will have looked at this. Can you tell us about Germinal and the content? And of course, they have these striking covers as well, don't they?
Yeah, actually, there's so much that she's written. I don't know much about Germinal. What I do know is that the diversity of the different issues that she took up. One person who was a painter, was a poet, was an editor, was a journalist, changed so much in many spheres. So I'm afraid I can't say that much about Germinal. We'll leave it to the experts, maybe some of those sitting next to you.
Right, okay. And now I interrupted you, I'm sorry. I think you were about to give me a burst of something.
So a few more quick thoughts, and then, please do interrupting. But one, the personal is political is a feminist saying for everybody. It's obviously particularly one for me. How unusual to have in a family so many role models that are cut across so many different issues. The militancy versus not, you heard a bit about how they campaigned in so many different ways, but also were not shy of being militant, being violent, being terrorists. The way I tell that story is that there's a ratcheting up of violence. They never set up to be as radical as they were, as violent as they were, but they kept on being blocked. And the choices were to be silent, to stop, to be quiet, to be female, to say okay, to be domestic, to retreat, to be nice, or to keep challenging. And as they challenged, the government became more and more violent. They became more and more violent. And I think that's the story of the militancy. I don't think I know that for most of them, this was against the grain. It was not what they wanted to do, but they felt forced into that.
Yes, it's interesting because really I know apart from the direct action, I've heard you say in previous addresses that the suffragettes showed great panache and flair, almost a modern sense of PR in the way they propagandized.
Yes, and I think it was Maxine who said that it's that history is textual and lyrical. They combined the feminine in so much. I can't see your space right now, but I'm told it's beautiful. Those colours of purple, white, and green, they are beautiful. They are powerful. They are still the colours of the feminist movement in so many countries. In the UK, there's a women's organisation, women's movements, as part of the Parliament. It's not part of Parliament, but part of the political space, the Women's Equality Party, and it uses those same colours. So the panache, the PR, the visual identity. And I think what was so powerful was the link between the feminine and the masculine. They had these feminine senses of beauty and aesthetic, and the domestic as powerful, the physical, the way they dressed, and the Edwardian delicacy of some of that. side by side with militant male ideas of how you campaign, how you march, how you use military badges of honor, of valor. And I think the combination of both is what they were so remarkable at doing.
I just want to bring Krystyna back at this point. So stay with us, Helen, because Krystyna, you've also collected some of these items that show this sort of flair and the breadth of the way they campaigned.
Yes, and that was largely Helen, your grandmother, Sylvia, who was trained, didn't actually finish her course because she went on the campaign development, but she trained for 2 years at Manchester Art School. She was a brilliant visualizer who could combine art, craft, and propaganda, again, for want of a better word. But yes, she defined the colours, the uniform, which was inverted commas, but the pure white dress, something white flowing, ultra feminine, because the characteristic of the press was she was a wizened old person, either with a rolling pin in her hand or with glasses, and no one ever wanted to talk to anyone a woman who wanted to vote. They showed women just like your mother and your sister. But the breadth of what she designed, she did design the Holloway Medal, which was awarded for women who went to prison, and the Hunger Strike Medal, which was awarded to people who went on the hunger strikes, which were absolutely dreadful processes. As I mentioned before, crockery that was used, so tea sets, all of them in very beautiful colours. Of course, again, white, purple and green, with the Angel of Freedom logo, again designed by Sylvia. So there was an incredible visual unification that came from the mind of Sylvia and the agreement of everyone else that she knew what she was doing. She certainly did.
We've just had a few slides
right.
going. Just go back to the brooch. Yes.
The Holloway brooch.
Because that's right. This shows the portcullis of the prison.
So it's the gates are actually it is the gates of the House of Commons. So it's the drawdown gates, like the iron gates we think of in old Gothic towers and whatever, and they're the ones that apparently are on the House of Commons, and superimposed are the prison arrows. You know, on prison uniforms you had the arrows that were worn by prisoners, but in this case in suffragette colours. And the chains on either side of the drawstring chains that brought the gate down. So again, absolutely brilliant and simple, but a perfect representation.
And then again with the colours. Yeah.
Yes.
So we go from that,
colours.
and there are also things like there's a card game.
Yes, a card game. I'm not sure whether who designed that, but they had a whole group of artists and practitioners around them. There was even a women's artist suffrage society. A lot of young women artists were very strong suffragists because they couldn't get on in their profession. They were not even allowed, some of them, to paint or to draw a nude man because that was considered improper. I mean, there were so many ridiculous things. But the vision to unite all of these things, and the card game. There's also another game like a snakes and ladders game.
And there's a cookbook.
And there's
to come back to the feminine.
They lost no. These things are also sold to make money for the movement. It was social enterprise. And the cookbook, there were a number of versions, I believe, put out, but there were a collection of recipes and a little bit of Aryan sarcasm mixed in there as well.
Yeah.
So they just look for any opportunity to make money.
Indeed. Helen, can I bring you back in? What special memorabilia, if anything, do you have in your family collection?
So I have a lot of Sylvia's art, so her painting, and interestingly, I'm involved, obviously, in continuing the family story and the push for equal representation of parliaments now in the UK. So I'm involved in something called Centenary Action, which is pushing for a gender equal parliament by 2028, which will be the centenary of equal franchise. And I'm using prints of Sylvia's as part of the fundraising process. So, the story goes round and round. But I wanted to add, I think the power of the suffragette movement was that individuals contributed their ideas and then they became part of the movement. This wasn't something where only a few people had ideas and then everybody else followed through. The sense of so many committed women going so far outside their comfort zone in terms of what they did, the marching, the speaking up, the breaking windows, they're thinking really laterally about what to do about how to change things. But also, the domestic, they were baking cakes, they were trying different recipes, they were sharing the recipes. And, cakes and tea is a really great space to enact change. And they were using that. I also wanted to say different economic positions. So the jewelry could be very, very cheap, or it could be very expensive. It could be stones and sapphires and all the rest of it, the right color combinations. I don't know my jewelry clearly, but whatever the right colors were that could mean that you could make your statement that way. And you could hide the statement, so it could be inside the lapel of a hat, for example, if you didn't feel confident or were worried about your image, or you could blazon it everywhere and show it to everybody. And then the final thing I wanted to say was, I don't know how many of you have seen the film Suffragette, but I'm hoping that everybody in the audience have seen it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just coming to that, and that came out, within the last decade or so, with Meryl Streep and Carey Mulligan. Now, you were advisor on that film.
Yes, and I had a cameo role, and I came to Australia promoting it. Actually, it's the only time I've come to your part of the world, and I would for those of you who've not seen it, please see it. It's a short, very powerful summary of the whole story, of everything that you've heard. It encapsulates it. My main recommendation was that at the end of the film, you have the dates about when women got the votes in the different countries. And I thought that was important to bring it to the closer in time and to universalize the story, because fundamentally, the reason why they were fighting for their rights, it was global, is global. And the links to so much violence at work, domestic violence, lack of women's power, economically, so many of the other factors that the film touches on resonate and explain why this was so important and continues to be so important.
Helen, my memory as well is that film ends with the dramatic and tragic suicide of Emily Davison, who threw herself under the King's horse at the Epsom Derby as a protest. This was 1913, so right on the eve of the war. This was, I gather, not an act sanctioned by the movement?
Correct. Nor were most of the acts initially sanctioned by the movement. So the initial stone throwing was not something that the leadership initiated. It wasn't something that Emmeline or Christabel or any of the leaders suggested. So that idea of militancy kind of coming, and the first hunger strike likewise. But Emily Welding Davison's act was not something planned. It was very much something that she initiated. There's a lot of controversy about whether she planned it to be a suicide, whether she knew she would not return. Her family are adamant that she didn't, that there's that return ticket and that she planned to come back. But she was willing to put her life on the line and had done so in quite dangerous ways in the past before. And many people will say it was only a question of time before somebody did die as a consequence of all of the things that were happening. Yeah. And in fact, she wasn't the only one. So Emmeline's sister, Mary, died soon after the one of the protests, the most violent protest in Westminster, when she was attacked by the police and hooligans, and she died soon after that. So she's probably the first person who died as a consequence of the violence of the police and the militant actions of the suffragettes.
Krystyna, just to come to the Emily Davison leaflet, we saw it briefly on a slide there, because this is quite rare, isn't it? This is the memorial leaflet printed for the very large public funeral of Emily
and it
Davison.
was an enormous funeral procession through central London. It brought the city to a standstill. And I think even people who may not have been supporting suffragettes to that point went to the funeral, because it was seen as a turning point, something quite shocking, but something meaningful. I think there was a huge amount of empathy for Emily.
Helen, we're going to let you go soon. I know this is early morning for you, but of course it sounds as if this remarkable family, has certainly influenced the course of your own life. Could you just tell us a little bit about that? You mentioned the centenary.
Yeah, absolutely. The global feminism is really everything that I've been working on, and now I do a lot in the UK as well. So this Centenary Action initiative, which is hosted by Care International, is trying to push for a gender equal parliament in the UK. And then we haven't touched on this, but the issue of how far to go with militancy is now resonating a lot in the environmental movement, where there are debates, Just Stop Oil in the UK and Extinction Rebellion, et cetera, et cetera. The question of how individuals push for change when there's a government that is resistant and does not think in those terms is very apposite, and people are thinking about the parallels between the suffragette movement and the environmental movement today. I campaign to look at the importance of a feminist lens when we think about climate change. It is very intricate. Women don't have the power. They are particularly badly affected by climate change, and that's one of the issues that I campaign on.
Helen, well, it's been a tremendous highlight for you to join us, and I note that wonderful purple shirt you've got on. Thank you so much for being part of this discussion at State Library.
Pleasure. Thanks for including me. Have a lovely evening.
It was a good surprise, wasn't it? I want to finish our discussion. We must come to Australia, and we have some marvellous items here about a very important campaigner. Anna, why don't you tell us about Vida Goldstein?
Yes, well, I feel actually probably both of you are better equipped than I am, particularly Maxine, your political career. I imagine that Vida would have been an inspirational role model for many women entering politics, although she herself didn't make it into
How many
Parliament.
times did she stand?
Oh, is it 8?
Was that many? Was it?
It was a number of quite a number of times. She wasn't successful, but she was essentially a lifelong dedicated campaigner, supporter of the WSPU, and a sort of, I suppose, an Australian arm of the Pankhurst movement in Great Britain, who was a very successful campaigner here in terms of her activism around women's rights, although not successful in achieving political office herself.
Because I think she was not aligned. She never joined any political party.
That's right. And I suppose in that sense she was perhaps closer to Sylvia's mindset around the fact that none of the political parties really found it in their interest to support women achieving the vote. So the best option was to go your own way. And although she didn't generate the political support to enter office, she certainly had an outsized effect, I think, on the women's suffrage movement here. And, it's significant that we have on the table a wonderful photograph of her selling Votes for Women, the WSPU newspaper, and also an incredible association copy of the History of American Women's Suffrage that was published by Susan B. Anthony and others. The copy that we have is actually inscribed to Vida and says basically congratulations to Australia's women for achieving what America's women have not yet achieved. So that was in 1907.
I love that story because, again, to come back to Helen's point about global feminism.
Absolutely.
Everyone's watching what everyone else is doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Although, of course, this is where it becomes a really important part of the Australian story to note that the Federation of Australia and subsequent extension of the right to vote to women across Australia did not include Indigenous women. And in the one territory where they had been included, or state rather, which was South Australia, So from, I think it's 1894, South Australia had granted all men and women the right to vote, which included Indigenous men and women. But that ruling was swept away by federation, and the right to vote was granted only to settler women. So, in fact, Indigenous people lost out in the process of federation, and it was not until 1967 that Indigenous women and men were granted the vote. So we have I think that was an interesting point Helen was making about the intersectional questions in the global feminist movement, and particularly in this historical women's suffrage movement, is a great reminder of why it's so important that we think in those intersectional ways today about supporting all the communities who are disenfranchised by the status quo.
Indeed. And Krystyna, of course, certainly women got the vote in 1901, but it wasn't until the 43 or 44 election before two women took their place in Canberra.
Yes.
Dame Enid Lyons and Dorothy Tangney.
Wasn't there, I thought 1921 was Edith Cowan.
No, not the 20s. No,
okay.
No.
Anyway, it's an awfully long time.
Yes,
isn't it?
that's right.
And
that's right. We're kind of slow to sort of move towards political representation. Yeah. But there's the other nice, I think, historic echo. You would both have, I think a lot of people in the room would have seen that on the night of the last federal election, in the seat of Goldstein, the Teal candidate, Zoe Daniel, claimed the seat in her name. There we are.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Let's just a couple of final things. Adela, you alluded to her. This is the fourth daughter. She ends up in Australia, and she has an introduction to Ida Goldstein, but in fact takes quite a different political path as she matures, doesn't she?
Yes, well, Adela came and was very active in the demonstrations against the forced conscription, which I think was 1917. She was extremely active. Photos of a tiny little lady, I think she was under 5 foot, being carried away by policemen as she stood with her arms crossed. And that was 1917. She married a trade unionist, but by the late 20s, she'd flipped to the other side, protesting against birth control, the thing that, in the end, the thing that liberated women more than anything else, that enabled women to join the workforce and become more active in Parliament, was birth control. And she was against it. So she flipped. I haven't read enough to know what caused that juxtaposition, but she was just as virulent in her opposition to birth control as she had been in her desire to agitate.
And I gather as we move through the 30s, she's quite pro-Japanese in her sentiment.
Yes,
that's another interesting point.
It's interesting.
But she is, as Helen said, she's one of the Pankhurst who's buried on Australian soil. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Look, just finally, we come to the present. And Krystyna, you and I were more or less the same vintage. Anna's just a cherub, really, as you can see. But you know what I noticed on International Women's Day last Friday? I opened up the Australian Financial Review. It had a wraparound for Presbyterian Ladies College, right? A full front and back ad. Then I went through it. There was a full lift out in the middle, all lauding the success of women in finance and business and telling lots of stories about female success. I looked at this and I thought, if you live long enough, this I think would even have been unheard of 10 years ago, certainly. It is a remarkable difference in the time, say, since we started in the workforce. Would you agree?
I think the whole move around International Women's Day, which was really initially begun as an issue about labour and women getting a fair deal in the labour market. I think it began in about 1910 or 11, but it was a labour movement. In the 70s, it changed to being a general feminist thing. But I agree, in the last 10 years, the celebration of women and women's achievements has gone through leaps and bounds. It's not necessarily changing anything yet, but the recognition is there. People are now doing studies about gender equality in pay and finding it's not what it should be. I don't think 10 or 15 years ago that would have happened. I think there is It's slow, it's almost glacial, but it's happening. It is happening. And I know that the younger generation, the girls that are now, 18 plus, they're going to be quite different, very different from women of my generation, which was more the 60s and 70s and a different kind of feminism. But it was pleasing to see the way that attitude is changing. But I did notice someone said, well, what I would not like, what they shouldn't be doing is inviting women to morning breakfasts when they've got to get up early, do all their work, and get to this breakfast before they go to work.
Oh, name him, shame him. Come on.
But in other words, a lot of companies were turning on things like that. But they required women to interfere with their lives in order to go. And it was a good comment. No more breakfast, do more. Give us more.
I see.
Equal pay would be better. Real equal pay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed that. I think it's been an enthralling discussion. Anna, thank you very much for the extraordinary work you do here. And Krystyna, to you, and I know Helen again, Helen Sykes and many others here are part of, I haven't got a brochure here, but Judy can just give me a brochure, that's right. Right, it's on your seat, the Women's Writers Fund. It's one of our terrific initiatives here, so if you taken any inspiration from what you've heard tonight, we would love your support. Thank you very much for being a terrific audience. And I think Monica's coming up to... Oh, we're having Q&A. Oh, look, silly me. Okay, who's got a question? Down the back.
Thank you. Thank you all. I really enjoyed this. I want to take up Helen's point, which I've been thinking about, as many of us have. What is radicalism now? I mean, you look at what the suffragettes did in terms of getting the vote for women, and now we have Extinction Rebellion. And, seriously, stopping a bridge for a little while or stopping the centre of the city, it's nothing compared to what the suffragettes did. In terms of saving the planet and saving humankind. So I'm just wondering if you had any reflections on then and now and what would be considered acceptable and not acceptable.
Well, I certainly wouldn't invite anyone to slash pictures here, but I think it's interesting to note that one of the actions of, I think it was Just Stop Oil, was to throw paint over the painting that was slashed by the suffragettes. So there is a callback there in the memory of activism around using public spectacle to enhance your message. I think that's really the question facing us all today, isn't it? Is how do we go about living our values and standing up for the things that we think need to change? And I think the kinds of actions that you see from Just Stop Oil and others are around getting the mass media's attention, which is something the suffragettes didn't have the luxury of at the time, although I know Maxine's got a lovely story about bringing the footage of Emily Wilding Davison's sad death.
Yes, it's a little bit of a trip down the time tunnel. When I was first working on This Day Tonight, does anyone remember that? That was a precursor to Nationwide and all those programs. And I was the only female reporter, the girl they called me. This was about 1975. And there was one other girl in the unit. This was Brisbane, okay, and her name was Trish Barraclough, and she was the researcher. And all the blokes looked at us and they said, these two will never get on. Well, come International Women's Day, or it was coming up, we both hatched, we said, we actually want to do a story on the origins of International Women's Day. And we actually sold this to our executive producer, who was, partially evolved. And he said, fine, okay, you've got 6 minutes. You can have, on Friday night, last story, which of course is the graveyard shift. We were thrilled to bits. And Trish went away and she found the black and white footage of Emily Davison. It's Pate film, I think, in this film, and it was about a 12-second clip or something, and we used that, and we also played the Bread and Roses music, which is close to my heart, and we thought we were such revolutionaries getting this 6 minutes to air, in prime time on the ABC it was either 75, 76. Sadly, Trish died last year. I told that story at her memorial. So,
well, you were revolutionaries, Maxine.
Can I give you a little quick answer about radicalism? I suppose I said earlier tonight I referred to domestic violence. It is the scourge of our time, and it's a hard issue because we have a very good set of responsive policies and quite a lot of funding from the state government. Other state governments doing much the same thing. We've got a national action plan from the federal government. But quite frankly, you're asking families and often men to utterly change their behaviour. It's social re-engineering, quite frankly, and it's a hard issue. Often the campaigns we are running, we find, cause a phenomenal backlash. It's a hard nut to crack. Another question.
Were you going to say something?
Oh, sorry,
on that one,
Krystyna.
Krystyna?
If you want to come in on that. Radicalism today.
Just in relation to that comment about the painting, it was Velasquez's Venus in the National Gallery in London. The Suffragettes, one of them slashed it quite badly in 1911 or 12. When the Extinction Rebellion person threw the paint at it, it's now covered with museum glass, so it's protected. I think her words were, "Women didn't get the vote by voting," which I thought it was a beautiful encapsulation of why you have to be an activist. So, and generally speaking, there have been a number of movements that have looked at the tactics of the suffragettes and have applied them. Even if you remember back to the IRA days, when all the worst days, sort of 1975 to the mid to late 80s, the hunger strikes that were taking place. They took place because the prisoners the IRA guys wanted to be recognised as political prisoners, not criminals. And the British government had changed the law to make them ordinary criminals. That was exactly why the suffragettes went on a hunger strike. They went on hunger strike because they wanted to be treated as, I think it's class 2 prisoner, political. It meant they were treated better and they were treated in the right context. But no, they never won that battle. And in the 80s, 10 Irish IRA people died, including Bobby Sands. We've forgotten all of that. But their ideas, the suffragettes' ideas, are there. They're with us. They're with us as recently as whenever the last protest was by Extinction Rebellion. So they're very successful at challenging society, and the tactics can still work.
Do we have another question? Yes.
Just going back to Edith Cowan for a second, Krystyna is right in that she was the first female elected to a parliament. It was the Western Australian Parliament in 1921, and then subsequently
I beg your pardon.
the two that you mentioned.
I had federal in my mind, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Krystyna, you mentioned Winston Churchill, who, of course, is held in great regard for other activities he did, but not quite held in such regard for refusing to give the vote to women. What finally made him see the light?
That's a very good question. But I think the war effort, because during the First World War, forget the fact that the suffragettes called a truce and everything else, women were the ones that ran England. They ran the factories. The women were, so many men mobilised that the country could only continue to run because of women. And I think that was the way things happened. It became absolutely impossible to deny this enormous group of people the vote when they were at least equally responsible for the almost victory or truce, whatever you want to call it. They were incredible. And I think the whole institution of society looked at women differently after that. But would it have been the same if the suffragettes hadn't been there for all of those years beforehand? I think that they drew attention. They changed the way people thought. And then after the First World War, it was obvious. It happened almost immediately. In fact, maybe even just before, I think it was before the armistice that they got the vote. So it's quite incredible.
It was women over
Women of
30,
property.
women of property.
Women of property. So it wasn't a universal female suffrage. That didn't come until 1928. But it was women of property. That's in England. Here it was all women, except for Indigenous women. We still had an exception.
And Anna, I think you've got an interesting point as well. When you've looked at the countries where either women still don't vote or often aren't able to vote, just tell us.
Well, we needed to double check what the status was of women's suffrage around the world, and in fact, the only nation in which women can't vote is the Vatican City, for fairly obvious reasons, in that only cardinals can vote in the Vatican City and women can't be cardinals in the Catholic Church. But there are many other countries where women technically can vote, but in reality cannot access that right without threat of violence or other adverse consequences. So I think that's along the lines of what Helen was saying earlier, that this, on one level, the vote has been achieved, but that certainly isn't the end of the struggle for equality and women's rights.
I saw a photo just in the past week of women in Tehran at the voting booths, and they've had recent elections, but the point they made was this is the lowest participation rate in many, many years, 40%, a 40% turnout. Imagine that. Okay, another, yes.
Maxine, I just want to point out that we've got Susan Hogan in the audience, who is the granddaughter of Adelaide, who moved Pankhurst, who moved to Australia.
And you are where?
Oh, hello.
You're very welcome.
Welcome.
This is horrible for me. I'm absolutely touched that everyone is so interested, and I'm overwhelmed that you're expecting me to say some words because I'm not good at it. But I'll tell you this fantastic piece of self-promotion for me. Because people have been telling me all my life what my grandparents did do and didn't do and how they said their name and the whole box. And I started a long time ago thinking, is this right? Is that right? And so I started research, and a lot of things happened, family, job, all the things happened. So the project has gone very slowly, but I have finished it.
Oh, bravo.
There is an enormous tome that hasn't got one wrong apostrophe, I know, and because that's what I was teaching people for so many years, and it's right. I don't know that anyone will ever want to read it apart from my children, but it's all done, and I'm telling you.
Well done.
Thank you, Susan. And you can see I've been completely hopeless MC. I've lost complete control of the final part of the rundown. But look, there's a gentleman there who would like to ask a question. Yes.
Thank you. On this question of women's suffrage, I was wondering if you could comment on links between the women's political activism in the early 20th century. Could you comment on links between the suffrage movement and the temperance movement, because women were very active in that. And it's interesting in the US with the relevant constitutional amendments in 1920, prohibition and women's suffrage. Well, yes, they happened at the same time, but were there similar links in Australia?
To be honest, I hadn't thought about that link, but I think it's certainly a valid one. But of course, many women in the temperance unions were not necessarily for women's rights. They just didn't want the men to drink. That
I
was
was
really
just
as
going to
simple
say,
as that.
it was called the Christian temperance movement.
Yes,
wasn't it?
they were
So it's-
typically, they were usually, I think, allied with a religious movement of some sort. But it's a very interesting point because women were front and centre of that movement that created the end of alcohol for a very limited time in America.
And I wonder if that, I'm just sort of thinking aloud here, but I wonder if there might be, as you've said, Krystyna, there are perhaps links between religious groups and those different activist movements, particularly perhaps a group like the Quakers, who were instrumental in Great Britain in prison reform and also in the early years of the suffragette movement in the north of England, particularly something we didn't quite get to, the Pankhurst family coming from Manchester and that radical heritage there, nonconformist religious beliefs. Whether that would be the same in the Australian context, I don't know, but I think that would be an interesting angle to look at.
And I've got one question here.
Yes, I wanted to comment on that. So Henrietta Dugdale, who was very influential and one of the first in Australia to set up branches for the suffragettes, was also a leading proponent of the Temperance Union, and she saw them go hand in hand. She believed women needed the right to vote because they were half of the population, but she was also involved in the Temperance Union. She was also influential in setting up some of the first halfway houses and safe houses for women experiencing domestic violence. And her experience was that the majority of those women who ended up coming to her for care, their husbands had been drunk, because in those days, alcohol was high proof and you didn't need to drink a lot to be completely off your rocker. So she said that women, if they went to the police, had no power, and that in order to change the laws, because you were effectively the property of the man and you had no power. So she believed that women needed the right to vote, because unless they had the right to vote, they couldn't change those laws that made them victims of domestic abuse without any escape. So she believed very strongly that temperance would help men be better husbands, and that the second part of that was women needed to vote.
Very interesting point. Very interesting point. I'd quickly add to that, when child allowances first came in, I think during the Depression at some point, it was paid into the mother's bank account for a very specific reason, so it wouldn't be spent at the pub. Last question.
I want to make a couple of points. First, that the emphasis was that in that period, there were three main associations for the women. There was the Pankhursts, which were by and large the most active and violent and prepared to be violent. There was the middle way, and then there were those, Millicent Fawcett, for example, who ran it, who wanted the moderate way going through the politics. And the other thing is that I would emphasise, we saw right at the beginning the absolute poverty of those women working in factories, but I want to emphasise that actually the women's movement was throughout the whole of society, from the highest to the middle class and the lowest, and I think that's important to know. And the other thing I would say is, Krystyna mentioned that during the war years women took over the factories. That's so, but also the important thing is that they started the first women's police force. And I would add that it was a Melbourne woman who was one of the very founders.
And her name?
That was Dora Meeson Coates.
Okay.
And she was living in London, and she was active throughout the period of suffrage, and she was one of the 2 or 3 founders of the women's police force, as well as many other
Another
things.
interesting point. I should add the Land Army as well. Let's not forget the Land Army. Okay. All right. Look, on that note, I am going to ask Monica to come back up here to give us some final notes and send us off. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Maxine, Krystyna and Anna, for your wonderful discussion, and also a thank you to Dr Helen Pankhurst, who braved the early hours of London to be part of this fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for your questions as well, and the wonderful audience participation this evening, and for coming along tonight. And I will just make a very special note of thanks to Susan Hogan for braving the comment and invitation, and as a descendant of Adela Pankhurst. And we absolutely look forward to receiving your tome into the state collection sometime soon. I hope you'll all stay a little bit longer and visit our collection viewing over here at the table and see some of the items that you've heard about this evening. A very big thank you to our collections curators for bringing along these items, as well as their expertise to talk you through some of the detail and of the items on display. We've been really fortunate to have already acquired so many works for the Women's Writers' Fund through the generosity of our donors. And there are still many more works we'd love to acquire, and your support can help us with that. Around the room, you'll see QR codes and brochures with information about how to donate to the fund. Your support of the Women's Writers' Fund will help us acquire these rare items and make them discoverable and accessible to all through the state collection, to ensure that the voices of women are not lost to history. Please enjoy the rest of the evening, and I look forward to seeing you at the library again soon. Thank you.